When people think of the Indiana Dunes National Park, they most often think of the high dunes that immediately surround Lake Michigan, and rightfully so. These enormous piles of sand bump right up against the lake and rise nearly 200 feet above water level. But today I'm going to skip past these dunes and instead explore some of the more inland areas of this region. There's a wide diversity of habitats here, including this oak forest on the backside of the high dunes. I'll be exploring various wetland types, including marshes, swamps, bogs, and rivers. And I'll also hike through a black oak savanna, which is a species-rich habitat that's become very rare. In this video, I'll feature some of the flora and fauna that stood out as I explored this area in late April. The first wetland area I visited is considered a boreal flatwoods forest, consisting of many vernal pools and rivulets. The winged seeds of red maple trees were strewn everywhere. Red maple likes its feet wet, and it thrives in swampy areas like this. Its seeds are much smaller than that of silver maple or box elder, which are the other maples in this area that drop their samaras in the spring. Among other trees that stood out were beech, which have these distinctive torpedo-shaped buds, an American hornbeam, which is an understory tree that has a smooth bark with grooves in it that give it a muscled appearance. Ironwood and musclewood are two other nicknames for this tree. Typical of understory trees, Carpinus caroliniana is leafing out earlier than most of the canopy, and its simple leaves resemble those of other trees in the birch family, Betulaceae. One of the first butterflies to appear in this spring is the red admiral. This butterfly is pretty chill compared to most others, which is key for me being able to get close and film them. Its primary host plants are in the nettle family, Urticaceae. The piney-looking plants you see in this shot are a type of club moss, which is one of the oldest lineages of plants originating 380 million years ago. These plants evolved long before flowering plants and rely on spores instead of seeds to reproduce. This particular species is the most widespread in the genus, and it occurs on all the continents except for Antarctica and Australia. Although it is globally widespread, it only occurs in undisturbed natural areas that do not experience regular burning, and this means it is now endangered in many areas. It's very unusual to see this plant in Indiana. In eastern North America, it occurs only in Canada, the northern states, and in the Appalachian Mountains. Another rare plant that stands out in these woods in late April is dwarf ginseng. This plant is in the same genus as the other two ginseng species that are sought after for their stimulant properties and supposed medicinal benefits. One of those two, Panax quinquefolius, occurs in North America. When the Europeans arrived in the 1700s, it quickly became overharvested, and as a result, it is now critically imperiled in many areas. Panax trifolius is much smaller than Panax quinquefolius, and it is not used in herbal medicine. But despite this, it also is imperiled in many areas. Next, I visited a wetland area on a glacial moraine that formed 15,000 years ago. Here, the most abundant wildflower was Pachyra glabella. This plant is native to areas further south, but it has been migrating northward and can be invasive in northern Indiana. The foliage on Pachyras is toxic to mammals. Deer and rabbits avoid them, but domestic livestock will sometimes poison themselves by eating it. A characteristic to look for to help identify plants in the sunflower family are the phyllaries around the base of each flower head. These occur in a single series for plants in the Senecio tribe, which Pachyra is a member of. Another plant that stood out in late April were the sassafras trees in flower. Sassafras is somewhat unusual for being dioecious, which means each tree only has male or female flowers. Looking closely at the flowers, we can see this one is a male due to all the stamens poking out. We can also confirm it's a sassafras tree because the small branches have a greenish color to them. Even some of the larger branches have hints of green in between the bark. The next tree that got my attention I initially mistook for a young maple because of the shape of the leaves and their opposite arrangement. But I knew I was off because maple trees don't produce berries. This plant is actually a non-native type of viburnum, commonly known as Gelder rose or a Eurasian cranberry bush. It's neither a rose nor a cranberry, and so those are bad names in my opinion. This individual was surprisingly tall, and it resembled a young tree rather than the bush or shrub that this species is classified as. Another trait I use to help confirm this is a viburnum is the compound cyme of flowers at the end of this shoot. This area also has a bog habitat, and underwater lives an interesting plant called a bladderwort. This is a carnivorous plant which captures small organisms by means of its bladder-like traps. Like most carnivorous plants, it occurs in a nutrient-poor environment where its carnivory gives it a competitive advantage. The next area I hiked was along the Little Calumet River where 3 different species of trilliums were in flower. This one is Trillium grandiflorum, so named because it has the largest flowers. An individual trillium plant won't begin flowering until it's about 7 years old, which is an unusually long time for a spring ephemeral, and they also have an unusually long lifespan. 25 years is fairly common, and I've read that some can live for 50 years or more. But do not pick them. Despite their longevity, picking them just once can kill the plant. The next type of trillium I saw was Trillium flexipes. This is sometimes called a nodding trillium because its flower is often tilted towards the ground. Like Trillium grandiflorum, it has white flowers, but they're smaller and its leaves are more broad. The other trillium occurring here is prairie trillium. That nickname is somewhat misleading because it grows in woodlands, not prairies. The reason it has that name is because it's very common in regions where prairies do occur. It's too bad I'm not a pollinator because this next plant always grabs my attention due to the waxy sheen of its flower petals. This is known as a swamp buttercup. Some authorities regard it as Ranunculus septentrionalis, but I'll go with iNaturalist for the ID here, which regards it as a variety of Ranunculus hispidus. Another member of the buttercup family in flower now is the rue anemone. There are a few different plants that look like this. To identify them correctly, you'll want to pay attention to the number of flower petals. Now technically these are not petals, but rather petal-like sepals, but regardless, this plant will have between 5 and 10 of them. You'll also want to look closely at the leaflet margins. There's another plant in the same family called the false rue anemone. False rue will always have exactly 5 petal-like sepals, and its leaflet margins are slightly more cleft than the rue anemone. The maroon flower hiding under this wild ginger plant is rather unusual. It certainly isn't wind-pollinated, being this close to the ground, and it's not doing much to attract bees or butterflies by hiding under the foliage with its drab color. Studies have shown this plant is mostly self-pollinated, and it relies on ants to disperse its seeds. Another plant I saw all over the place were these hepaticas with their distinctive leaves. This species is one of the first to flower in the spring, and this one has already finished up doing so. All that's left are these 3 leafy bracts and a cluster of carpels containing the seeds. Next, I visited a black oak savanna. Savannas are a mix of woodlands and grasslands where the trees are spaced widely enough so that most of the sunlight reaches the ground. They tend to have more diversity than the surrounding forests and prairies combined, but they've become a rare habitat. Since the arrival of European settlers, most of these lands were converted to farmland and cities. And in the remaining natural areas, the practice of fire suppression allowed shrubs and fire-intolerant trees to take over, which converted them into forests. Among the plants showing themselves now, one of the most striking is the emergence of the common bracken fern, Pteridium aquilinum. This fern has extremely light spores, which can travel long distances in the atmosphere, and this helps give it a worldwide distribution. The young fiddleheads have a long history of being consumed by people in many parts of the world, but studies indicate the presence of carcinogenic compounds in this plant, and so many authorities now advise against consumption. Another plant growing here that flowers in the spring is the sundial lupin. Lupins are in the pea family, and they're important because they partner with bacteria to fix nitrogen into the soil. Next, I hiked along the edge of a marsh habitat. Here, another type of ancient plant was growing, Equisetum arvense. The ancestors of Equisetums emerged 375 million years ago, with some attaining tree-like stature with heights over 50 feet. This particular species produces non-photosynthetic shoots in the early spring, which have these cone-like structures at the tips of its stems where its spores are produced. This plant can become weedy, but the tubers and rhizomes reach deep into the soil and make it difficult to remove. Spring is the time that many reptiles and amphibians, like this bullfrog, emerge from their winter hibernation sites to breed. Just below a beaver dam, there were many water snakes roaming about and basking in the sun. This type of snake is non-venomous to humans, but it will defend itself vigorously if threatened. It will bite you if you try and pick one up. This snake can vary in color, but as it grows older, it will generally become darker and its banding pattern will become more obscure. The final type of habitat I visited was a swamp. The difference between a marsh and a swamp is that a swamp is mostly forested, whereas a marsh has mostly herbaceous plants rather than woody plants. These plants with the giant leaves have a very appropriate common name, skunk cabbage, because the crushed leaves smell like a combination of skunk and boiling cabbage. This is another plant that gets going very early in the season. It's already done flowering, and now it's taken advantage of the extra sunlight available before all the canopy trees leaf out. Next, we have a wild strawberry. This is a common plant that can grow in a variety of habitats. It's one of two species that were hybridized to create the cultivated strawberry. It has 10 green sepals under the flower petals, and triflate leaves that are green on top and pale green on the bottom. You'd be forgiven if you didn't know these odd-looking things are a type of plant. One name for it is bear corn. It's a parasitic plant that steals its nutrients from the roots of oak and beech trees. Bear corn is in the Orobanchaceae family. Another plant in this family is Pedicularis canadensis. This one is a hemiparasite, where it produces chlorophyll on its own, but it also steals nutrients from other plants. And if that's not weird enough, it also has a symbiotic relationship with a type of fungus to help it gather nutrients. The hooded flowers of this plant can be yellow or brownish red. Its leaves have a fern-like appearance. and it's pollinated by bumblebees, including this one who's fixing on taking a nap. Well, that's it for this tour of wetland and savanna habitats of northwest Indiana in late April. This region is a transition zone from north to south and east to west. And the Indiana Dunes National Park claims to have the fourth most species diversity among all national parks. It's a wonderful place to visit for naturalists at any time of the year.